Somewhere tonight, a woman will walk into a hospital room. She will be surrounded by nurses, monitors, bright lights, and at least one person whose only job is to make sure she is not alone. You probably assume this is a modern invention. Comfort, convenience, a safety net built by science. But the real answer is far stranger. That room, that circle of helpers, that refusal to let her labor by herself, is not new at all. It is one of the oldest habits your species ever formed, and it may be the reason you exist. Start with your body. Your hips are narrower than they should be. Not narrow in a fragile way, narrow in a mathematical way. Narrow compared to the size of a newborn human skull trying to pass through them. For decades, scientists called this mismatch the obstetrical dilemma. The anthropologist Sherwood Washburn first proposed the idea in the 1960s. He argued that when your ancestors stood upright, their pelvis had to narrow to support walking on two legs efficiently. At the same time, their brains were getting bigger, two evolutionary pressures pulling in opposite directions. A wider pelvis makes walking harder, a narrower one makes birth harder. Something had to give. What gave was you. Human babies are born earlier than almost any other primate, relative to how developed their brains eventually become. A newborn chimpanzee is born with a brain already close to half its adult size. A human newborn arrives with a brain closer to a quarter of its final size. You were pushed out early, helpless, unable to walk, cling, or even hold up your own head. Every human who has ever lived came into the world underdone, a work in progress, entirely dependent on someone else showing up. That dependency did not start after birth. It started during it. Here is the part most people never think about. Birth, for you, is dangerous in a way it simply is not for most other animals. A newborn's head has to rotate as it moves through the birth canal, twisting almost 90 degrees at points, because the pelvis is not a simple straight tube. It is narrow, then wider, then narrow again in a different direction. Most mammals give birth to offspring who exit facing the same way the mother is facing. She can reach down, she can guide the baby out herself. She can clear its airway alone. You cannot. Because of how the human pelvis twists the baby during descent, most human infants are born facing away from the mother, not toward her. Try to picture what that means in practice. A woman giving birth alone, without help, would have to reach behind and below herself, blind, to catch a baby facing the wrong direction, often as it is still turning. She would have to do this at the exact moment she is in the most physical distress of the entire process. The anthropologist Wenda Trevathan, who has spent much of her career studying the evolution of childbirth, argued that this anatomical detail is not a small inconvenience. It is the reason humans developed something almost no other primate relies on so heavily: assistance. Trevathan's research proposed what is now called the birth attendant hypothesis. The idea is simple, and once you hear it, you cannot unsee it everywhere. Human childbirth became so mechanically difficult, so dangerous for both mother and infant, that natural selection favored women who sought help during labor. Not help as a luxury, help as a requirement for survival. A mother alone in the grass, in a cave, in a hut, facing a baby that could suffocate on its own umbilical cord or fail to be positioned correctly, needed hands that were not her own. So she called out, and someone came. Anthropologist Karen Rosenberg, working alongside Trevathan, expanded this idea further by comparing human birth patterns across dozens of cultures, from foraging societies to agricultural ones, from the Arctic to the tropics. Nearly all of them shared one detail. Isolated, unassisted birth was rare. Not forbidden exactly, just deeply unusual. In society after society, someone was present. A mother, a sister, an older woman from the group who had done this before and knew what to watch for. This pattern showed up again and again, in places that had never had any contact with one another, on opposite sides of the planet, separated by oceans and thousands of years. Why would the same behavior appear independently, over and over, in cultures with nothing else in common? Because it was not culture, it was biology wearing the mask of culture. Picture the scene as it likely played out, hundreds of thousands of years ago, somewhere in the grasslands of what is now East Africa. A woman feels the first waves of labor begin. She does not retreat into the brush alone the way a gazelle might. A newborn gazelle can stand and run within minutes of birth, which means its mother can afford to labor in solitude, hidden from predators, needing no one. Your ancestors had no such luxury. Their offspring could not run, could not even lift their own heads. So instead of retreating, the laboring woman moved toward other people, toward firelight, toward the sound of voices she trusted. This single behavioral shift, small and quiet and easy to overlook, may have been one of the earliest forms of organized cooperation your species ever practiced. Before language as you know it, before tools as complex as the ones you use today, before almost anything you would recognize as culture, there was this: women helping women survive the one moment evolution had made almost impossibly difficult. Think about what that means for how your brain developed. If birth required trust, community, and the presence of others who remembered what to do, then the earliest humans were selected not just for bigger brains, but for the social skills required to live in groups that could support one another through crisis. The capacity for empathy, the instinct to respond to distress, the willingness to physically show up when someone else is suffering. These traits were not just nice additions to human life. They may have been prerequisites for human life to continue at all. There is another layer to this story, one that is easy to miss because it is so ordinary now. Ancient birth attendants were not doctors. They had no training in the way you would define it. What they had was memory. They remembered what had worked the last time. They remembered which positions eased the pain. They remembered how long was normal to wait, and when waiting became dangerous. This knowledge passed from woman to woman, not through writing, but through presence, watching, doing, being taught by hands, not books. This is likely one of the oldest transmitted knowledge systems in human history, not agriculture, not fire, birth care, and it never really stopped. Consider who this knowledge likely lived inside of. Anthropologists studying hunter-gatherer societies have long noted that women past reproductive age often occupied a strange and powerful position in the group. They were no longer bearing children themselves, yet they remained physically capable, deeply experienced, and endlessly useful. Some researchers have connected this to what is sometimes called the grandmother hypothesis, the idea that women who live decades past menopause do so, evolutionarily speaking, because their presence increases the survival odds of their grandchildren. Some of that help came in the form of food gathering. Some came in the form of childcare, but some of it, quietly, came in the form of exactly this: standing beside a younger woman in labor and saying, in effect, "I have seen this before, and you are going to be fine." Look closer at how this played out in real, documented societies, not just in theory. Among the Fa people of the Congo Basin, birth has traditionally involved multiple women present, not one. Among many indigenous communities across the Americas, a designated, respected elder often guided the process, sometimes using specific plants, specific postures, specific rhythms of breathing, passed down for generations. In parts of Southeast Asia, the role of birth attendant was so central to community life that the woman who held it was often one of the most socially significant figures in the entire village, consulted not only during labor but throughout pregnancy and long after. These practices differ wildly in their specifics. The plants are different, the songs are different, the postures are different, but the underlying architecture is nearly always the same. Someone experienced, someone present, someone who has done this before and is not afraid. Ask yourself why fear matters so much here. A woman in labor is, whether she consciously registers it or not, in a state of extreme physiological vulnerability. Her body is diverting enormous resources toward a process it cannot pause or reverse. In that state, panic is dangerous. Adrenaline can slow labor, tense the very muscles that need to relax, and in some cases increase the risk of complications. This is part of why so many traditional birth attendants placed enormous value on calm, steady voices, familiar hands, rhythmic reassurance. Long before anyone understood the hormonal mechanics behind it, ancient women had already discovered, through trial and generational memory, that fear was a physical threat during labor, not just an emotional one. Calming a laboring woman was not kindness alone. It was, quite literally, a survival strategy. You might assume this kind of care was primitive compared to a modern hospital. In some ways, it absolutely was less safe. Maternal mortality throughout most of human history, and even into the early 20th century in parts of the world, was devastatingly high. Infection, hemorrhage, and prolonged obstructed labor killed women in numbers that are difficult to fully comprehend from where you sit now. But the instinct underneath all of it, the refusal to let a woman labor completely alone, was not primitive at all. It was, in a very real sense, ahead of its time. Modern medicine eventually rediscovered something ancient humans had already understood on some level for hundreds of thousands of years. Support during birth improves outcomes. Not just physically, psychologically too. Studies conducted decades later, in fully modern hospital settings, would go on to confirm something that would have seemed obvious to a Paleolithic birth attendant. Women who have continuous support during labor, whether from a partner, a doula, a nurse, or a trained companion, tend to have shorter labors, fewer complications, and lower rates of intervention than women who labor without that kind of presence. The body responds to feeling safe. Stress hormones interfere with labor progression. Calm, trusted company can measurably change the physical experience of birth itself. A body that feels watched over, in the protective sense, behaves differently than a body that feels abandoned. Your ancestors did not have this research. They did not need it. They had thousands of generations of trial and observation, quietly encoded into cultural practice, long before anyone wrote it down. There is a modern echo of all this that rarely gets discussed. Beginning in the mid-20th century, researchers in a handful of hospitals began formally testing what traditional societies had assumed for hundreds of thousands of years. What happens if a laboring woman has one continuous, dedicated companion by her side? Not a rotating cast of medical staff, but a single, steady presence, from the early hours of labor through delivery. The results, replicated across multiple studies in different countries, were strikingly consistent. Labors were shorter. Requests for pain medication dropped. Cesarean rates fell. Reported satisfaction with the birth experience rose sharply. None of this required new equipment or new drugs. It required, essentially, reinventing the role that had existed in human societies since before recorded history, and giving it a modern name, doula, derived from an ancient Greek word originally meaning a woman who serves. Now think about what has actually changed since then, and what has not. You live in a world with epidurals, ultrasounds, cesarean sections, and neonatal intensive care units. The tools are unrecognizable compared to a hut lit by fire 200,000 years ago. Cesarean delivery in particular represents one of the few moments in history where medicine has actually reached past the limits your body evolved with. When a baby's head is simply too large for the pelvis to accommodate, no amount of ancient wisdom or trusted companionship could have changed the outcome. For most of human history, this specific complication was often fatal for the mother, the infant, or both. Surgery solved a problem that evolution itself had never fully resolved. But strip away the technology surrounding the exceptional cases and look at the shape underneath the ordinary ones. A woman in labor today is still, in almost every documented culture on Earth, surrounded by other people. A partner holding her hand. A nurse checking in every few minutes. A doula coaching her breathing. This is not a coincidence of modern comfort. It is the same ancient behavior, running on new infrastructure. Even the instinct to seek out someone experienced, someone who has done this before and can say this is normal or this is not, is a direct echo of that first woman who called out toward the fire instead of retreating into the dark alone. There is something worth sitting with here, something that goes beyond birth itself. If cooperation, empathy, and the willingness to show up for someone else in crisis were literally necessary for your species to survive its own reproduction, then those traits are not soft additions to what makes you human. They are foundational to it. You did not become a social species because it was pleasant. You became a social species because the alternative, quite often, was death, yours or your child's. It also reframes something you may have taken for granted about human relationships in general. You live in a culture that often celebrates independence, self-reliance, the ability to handle hard things alone. But the single most physically demanding, most dangerous, most universal experience your species has ever produced was never meant to be handled alone. Not once, not anywhere, across the overwhelming majority of documented human history. If there is one moment that proves interdependence is not a weakness but a core feature of being human, this is it. The people who survived long enough to become your ancestors were not the ones who insisted on doing it themselves. They were the ones who reached for someone else, and the ones who answered when someone else reached for them. This might explain something else too. The reason so many people, even now, describe childbirth not just as a medical event, but as one of the most emotionally intense, deeply witnessed moments of their lives. The presence of others during birth is not sentimental decoration, layered on top of biology. It may be the very thing biology was counting on all along. There is also a physical dimension to this that goes beyond emotional comfort. A second set of hands during labor can do things a woman alone simply cannot. Applying counterpressure to ease back pain. Helping shift her into positions that use gravity to assist the baby's descent. Recognizing early warning signs, a change in color, a change in breathing, a change in the rhythm of contractions, that the laboring woman herself, deep inside her own pain and exhaustion, may not notice in time. This is not a small advantage. In the era before modern monitoring equipment, a sharp-eyed, experienced attendant was often the only early warning system that existed. Her trained attention, built from watching dozens or even hundreds of prior births, functioned as a kind of living diagnostic tool, centuries before anyone invented a fetal heart monitor. Think, for a moment, about how strange this makes the modern experience of being born alone into an empty room, medically supervised but emotionally isolated, which some women in industrialized settings have described feeling, especially during eras when hospital policy kept partners and family out of delivery rooms entirely. That policy, common through much of the 20th century in many Western hospitals, may have unintentionally worked against something your biology had spent hundreds of thousands of years building. It is worth noting that as this policy has relaxed in recent decades and continuous labor support has become more common again, outcomes and reported well-being have both tended to improve. In a strange way, modern obstetrics did not invent the idea of the supportive birth companion. It simply had to rediscover something it had briefly, almost accidentally, taken away. So the next time you picture a delivery room, with its machines and monitors and quiet urgency, remember what it actually is underneath all of it. It is not a symbol of how far you have come from your ancestors. It is proof of how little, in the ways that matter most, you have ever left them behind. Somewhere tonight, a woman will walk into that room, surrounded by people who refuse to let her labor alone. And in that single act, without anyone in the room realizing it, 200,000 years of human survival will quietly repeat itself.